The empty cradle. 6 months had passed since Emma and David lost their newborn daughter, Lily. The crib they had lovingly prepared sat untouched in the nursery, gathering dust. Emma spent her days in silence, wandering through the house, consumed by her grief. David, on the other hand, buried himself in work, avoiding the suffocating pain that haunted their home. One night, Emma woke to the faint sound of crying. Her heart stopped. It was unmistakable, the soft, desperate wail of a baby. She scrambled out of bed, her pulse pounding in her ears, and followed the sound to the nursery. The door creaked open slowly. The crib, which had been empty for so long, now swayed slightly, as if someone had just laid a baby in it. Emma froze. The room was cold, unnaturally so, and the air was thick with a heavy, oppressive presence. She approached the crib, her breath shallow, eyes wide with disbelief. There, in the crib, was Lily. But something was wrong, horribly wrong. The baby's face was pale and lifeless, her eyes black in pits. Yet she was moving, writhing slightly in the crib as if something was animating her lifeless body. Emma staggered backward, her mind reeling. She blinked and Lily was gone. The crib empty again. Night after night, the same thing happened. The cries, the crib, the ghostly figure of her child appearing, only to vanish. Emma couldn't tell David. She knew he would think she had lost her mind. But the truth was darker than she could have imagined. The baby wasn't a hallucination, it was something far worse. David finally noticed Emma's deteriorating condition. Her hollow eyes, the way she no longer seemed to sleep. He was convinced she needed help, but Emma refused, terrified to leave the house and abandon the haunting presence of her child. One evening, as Emma lay in bed, paralyzed by exhaustion, the crying came again, louder, more desperate than ever before. This time, David heard it too. He rushed to the nursery only to find Emma cradling something in her arms, something that wasn't there. Her eyes were wide and crazed, her lips muttering softly to the empty space she held. But then, the shadow appeared. David saw it. Looming in the corner of the room, a figure cloaked in darkness, its face hidden beneath a tattered hood. The room grew impossibly cold, and as David stepped toward Emma, the shadow moved closer to the crib. The air around them seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Suddenly, Emma let out a blood-curdling scream. The shadow reached out, its long, skeletal fingers grazing the edge of the crib. In an instant, the room erupted with an ear-splitting wail, a sound so terrible it seemed to shake the walls themselves. David grabbed Emma and pulled her out of the room, slamming the door shut behind them. But it was too late. From that night on, the crying never stopped. Day and night, it echoed through the house, filling every corner with the sound of their lost daughter's cries. It was as though the grief that had once consumed them had taken on a life of its own, a spectral force haunting their every waking moment. And deep in the nursery, the crib still rocked. Weeks went by, but sleep never came for Emma and David. The house had become a prison of relentless torment, haunted by the ceaseless cries of their dead child. Emma refused to leave the house, convinced that Lily was trapped, trying to come back to them. The once bright woman had faded into a hollow shell, her only focus on the nursery and the empty cradle that rocked on its own. David, desperate and afraid, called a priest to bless the house. But the crying only grew louder after he left. Every attempt to rid the house of the haunting presence seemed to strengthen it, as if acknowledging the horror gave it more power. They were trapped in a nightmare of their own grief. One night, while David sat on the living room couch, his head buried in his hands, he heard a soft voice calling his name. He looked up, and standing at the top of the stairs was a little girl. Her pale face glowed faintly in the dim light, her eyes empty of life, and her mouth slightly open. She wore the same baby blue dress they had buried Lily in. "Daddy, help me!" David's heart raced. He knew this couldn't be real. Their daughter had never lived to take her first steps, let alone call out to him. But the image was so real, so vivid. Tears filled his eyes as he stepped toward her. "Lily!" His voice trembled. "Is it really you?" The girl tilted her head, her expression blank and unnerving. "Come with me, Daddy. I'm cold." David was frozen, torn between the overwhelming desire to believe it was his daughter and the gnawing fear clawing at his insides. Before he could respond, Emma appeared behind him, her face pale as death. "David, don't listen." Emma's voice was sharp and commanding, something he hadn't heard in weeks. She grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "That's not Lily." But the figure at the top of the stairs smiled, a grotesque, hollow grin that twisted her small features. The light in the hallway flickered, and the air turned frigid. "You can't save her," the girl hissed, her voice morphing into something dark and guttural. "She's mine." David stumbled back, fear seizing him as the lights dimmed further. The figure vanished, leaving only the echo of a child's laughter trailing into the dark. The couple stood in silence, the air heavy with dread. Emma had finally broken through her grief enough to see the truth. Whatever was haunting them wasn't their child. It was something far darker, something that had taken advantage of their sorrow. That night, Emma did something she hadn't done since Lily's death. She picked up the phone and called her mother. "Mom, I need to stay with you for a while," Emma whispered, her voice barely steady. "We can't stay here anymore." David agreed, though neither of them believed that leaving would be the end of their torment. The house wasn't just haunted by grief. It had become a gateway to something much worse. As they packed their bags in silence, the cries intensified, echoing through the walls, filling every corner of the house. The nursery door creaked open on its own, and the cold draft swept through the hall. The shadow reappeared. This time it was no longer content to lurk in the corners of their vision. It stood tall at the end of the hallway, its skeletal fingers stretched toward them. The temperature dropped rapidly, frost creeping up the windows as the house groaned under the weight of something ancient and evil. "David!" Emma screamed as the figure lunged forward, moving faster than anything should be able to. In a frantic rush, David grabbed her arm and bolted toward the front door. The walls trembled, the cries now a deafening cacophony that shattered their nerves. The front door slammed shut before they could reach it, trapping them inside. The shadow loomed closer, its eyes burning with malevolent intent. It wanted more than just to scare them. It wanted to consume them, to feed on their grief and despair. But then, in the midst of the chaos, Emma did something unexpected. She dropped to her knees in the middle of the hallway, staring directly at the shadow. "Take me instead," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Leave David, but take me." The shadow paused. The cries ceased, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. The air was thick with anticipation as the shadow hovered above her. David screamed for her to stop, but Emma was resolute. She was willing to sacrifice herself, hoping that by doing so, the entity would release its grip on her husband. Tears streamed down her face, the weight of her grief unbearable, her body shaking with fear and sorrow. The shadow shifted, its form writhing, as if considering her offer. But before it could move, the front door burst open with a gust of wind, and in the doorway stood the priest they had called earlier. He held up a large cross, his voice booming as he began to chant in Latin. The shadow screeched, its form dissolving into the mist as it retreated into the nursery, the door slamming shut behind it. The room shook violently for several moments, and then everything stopped. The house was silent once more. Emma collapsed into David's arms, sobbing uncontrollably, her body weak from the ordeal. The priest, pale and shaken, stepped forward. "It's not over," he warned. "The grief you carry has made this house a beacon for spirits. It will return if you don't leave." They didn't need to be told twice. Without a second glance, they grabbed their things and fled the house, leaving behind the memories, the cries, and the horror that had nearly consumed them. As they drove away, Emma looked back at the house one last time. The shadow stood in the nursery window, watching them leave. It was still waiting. As they drove further away, the house slowly faded into the distance. Emma exhaled, trying to let go of the terror that had consumed them for so long. But just as they turned the final corner, a sound rose faintly from the back seat, the unmistakable, soft, desperate wail of a baby. Emma's blood turned to ice. She and David locked eyes, and when they turned around to look, the back seat was empty, except for a single pale blue blanket, folded neatly where no one had placed it. The cries began again.